Welcome back to Click Revision. This video continues our examination of each of the characters in An Inspector Calls, this time focusing on Sheila Birling. We'll be looking at how Sheila is described at the beginning of the play, her relationship with Eva Smith, and how she behaves before, during, and after the inspector's visit in a little more detail. Sheila Birling is possibly the most complex character in An Inspector Calls, and is certainly the character who shows the most progression throughout the play. It's fair to say that, unlike her parents, Sheila is deeply affected by the inspector's visit, and shows a great deal of remorse for the death of Eva Smith. This also means that, unlike Mr. and Mrs. Birling, her feelings towards some of the themes of charity and responsibility change as the play progresses. As she says herself, she is not the same person at the end of the play as she is when it begins. So, at the start of the play, Sheila could be described as innocent, light-hearted or witty, and even naive, which means she doesn't know much about how the world works. The stage directions at the opening of the play tell us that Sheila is a pretty girl in her early 20s, very pleased with life and rather excited, which doesn't give us much to go on, but at least makes her sound like someone who lives an untroubled existence. She's pleased with life, and everything is going well for her in general. She's also rather excited because of her engagement to Gerald, and so she should be. She's getting engaged to a successful, young, well-bred local boy, and her parents couldn't be happier with the choice she has made. Is it important that she's a pretty girl? Well, you could argue that Priestley could have chosen to describe Sheila as pretty, so an audience would instantly recognise her as someone who lives a privileged life. Here, being beautiful is just another example of how everything comes easily to her. So, overall, she's in a bubbly mood and having a lovely time when we meet her. In fact, a lot of Sheila's dialogue in the early part of An Inspector Calls suggests that she's a fairly shallow young woman, and before the inspector's arrival she comes across as a bit childish. She makes a lot of jokes and teases Eric and Gerald and uses modern young people words like squiffy, which her mother disapproves of. However, we should try not to think of Sheila as just a silly young girl, because she's actually quite a strong, forceful character. Let's take a look at her first line. On the surface, she's making a joke about the sort of purple-faced old men who drink a lot of port, but there's more information hidden under the surface here. Firstly, Sheila's language when she says, "I should jolly well think not," shows her to be upper class, but not as reserved and posh as her mother. The phrase jolly well is about as close to swearing in public as an upper-class lady of the time would get. Secondly, by contrasting Gerald to the purple-faced old men she mentions, she's highlighting how young and attractive she thinks Gerald is by comparison. From this line and the casual tone she's using, and the fact they are sat together on stage, it's clear she admires Gerald, and you can assume their engagement is based on love and isn't just about money. And finally, there's a big clue to Sheila's character in the stage directions here. Sheila is described as acting gaily and possessively, so she's almost giddy with happiness, and light-hearted in the way she speaks, but she is also possessive, so she's asserting power over Gerald and is putting him in his place even if she's making a joke at the same time. Sheila is a bit spoiled, and reacts spitefully or passive-aggressively to things not going how she would have wanted. She has a habit of being a bit bitter or sarcastic towards people, even when she's joking, and is described as half playful, half serious more than once. Basically, when Sheila's upset, she takes it out on the people around her. As Eric says, she's got a nasty temper sometimes, and this is important because it's this snappy, nasty, reactionary side of her character that comes into play when she meets Eva Smith. But generally, Sheila is a fairly good judge of character. She knows her brother better than her parents do, and is the person to reveal Eric's heavy drinking. Furthermore, she's already suspicious of Gerald over the mysterious summer he spent working lots, which we later find out was spent with Daisy Renton. And when Gerald recognises the name of the dead girl, she notices that Gerald clearly knew her. Look at this line. Here, Sheila is talking on equal terms with Gerald and standing up for herself at the same time. She is also extremely sarcastic towards Gerald when he tells his story, describing him as the wonderful fairy prince and the hero of the story. We'll cover this aspect of Sheila's relationship in more detail in Gerald's video. But for now, just hold on to the fact that Sheila's not afraid to speak up for herself, particularly when she feels hurt or wronged. After all, she's still browbeating Gerald about spending too much time at work the previous summer, and that was 7 months ago. Nonetheless, Sheila is still a woman in 1912, and does conform to some of the stereotypes of the era. Firstly, when Gerald is toasting his new bride, Sheila warns him, "You be careful or I'll start weeping." Obviously, this is a very sappy response and shows her childish, innocent side. Additionally, when Gerald takes the engagement ring out of his pocket, Sheila refers to it as the one you wanted me to have, which suggests that Gerald chose her engagement ring for her. And finally, once dinner is finished, she and her mother go into the drawing room and leave the dining room to the men, which means she isn't in the room when the inspector arrives. By the time she returns, the inspector has already finished questioning Mr. Birling and is ready to turn his attention to her. Sheila is the second family member to be interviewed by the inspector and was the second family member to meet Eva Smith. Sheila met Eva Smith in January 1911. That's 4 months after she'd been sacked from Birling and Company. Now, Sheila's run-in with Eva Smith is probably the simplest of all the Birlings. Eva Smith was working at Millward's, a local department store, after being fired from Birling's factory. Sheila goes in Millward's and tries on a dress, but looks silly in the thing. At this point, Eva Smith holds the dress up, and it suits her better than it does Sheila. Sheila looks over and thinks she sees Eva Smith smiling to her boss, and because Eva Smith is pretty and attractive, she feels jealous and embarrassed. Therefore, Sheila complains to the manager until Eva Smith is fired from her job. "I went to the manager and told him that this girl had been very impertinent," she says. Now, there are 2 important points to take away here. The first is that impertinent is very much a Mrs. Birling word. She uses it 3 times in the play. And there's an argument to be made that Sheila was simply copying her mother's behaviour when she got Eva Smith fired. The second thing to take away here is the idea that the Birling family is rich and powerful enough in the community that if they make a complaint in a shop, it will be followed up. If they make a threat to take their custom away, even if it comes from a stroppy, spoilt younger daughter of the family, it will be taken seriously. Sheila says, "I went to the manager at Millward's and I told him that if they didn't get rid of that girl, I'd never go near the place again and I'd persuade Mother to close our account with them." The Birling family clearly spends a lot of money in the shop, and Sheila abused her parents' power as respected members of the community for her own gain. However, Sheila does not react with that same sense of false pride after the inspector arrives. She is horrified by the circumstances of Eva Smith's death, saying, "I can't help thinking about this girl, destroying herself so horribly." She also shows she has a social conscience straight away when she finds out Mr. Birling fired Eva Smith, and tells her father, "I think it was a mean thing to do. Perhaps that spoilt everything for her. But these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people." She is clearly showing empathy for the dead girl here. And we can compare this to Mr. Birling's "yes, yes" response to the death, to see just how different Sheila is to her father in this regard. Furthermore, when she sees the inspector's photograph, she's so horrified at being implicated in Eva Smith's death that she bursts into tears and runs out the room. And we can compare this behaviour to Mrs. Birling, who is so unmoved that she still pretends to not recognise the person in the picture. When Sheila returns again, she is remorseful. She remembers the incident and gives the impression that she knew she was being unreasonable at the time. "I felt rotten about it at the time, and now I feel a lot worse," she says, suggesting that she has thought about the incident since. She asks, "So I'm really responsible?" and immediately accepts the idea that she could be in some way to blame for Eva Smith's death. The stage direction here leaves us in little doubt that the inspector has gotten under Sheila's skin. Let's have a look at some of Sheila's comments in this section of the play. In these quotes, Sheila is explaining herself to the inspector, but she's not making excuses at all here, and the inspector isn't judging her responses. In fact, he's not even really interrogating Sheila, he's just letting her talk. So she carries on talking. She says, "And it just suited her. She was the right type for it, just as I was the wrong type. She was very pretty too, with big dark eyes, and that didn't make it any better. How could I know what would happen afterwards? If she'd been some miserable, plain little creature, I don't suppose I'd have done it, but she was very pretty and looked as if she could take care of herself. I couldn't be sorry for her. And if I could help her now, I would. It's the only time I've ever done anything like that, and I'll never do it again to anybody. These lines make it clear that Sheila is contrite, which means she's sorry for what she's done. She openly admits that she probably picked on Eva Smith because she was very pretty, and regrets her behaviour, which didn't seem to be anything very terrible at the time. At this point, the inspector has finished his questioning, but Sheila feels too guilty to leave. The inspector has made such an impression on her that she feels compelled to stay and hear everything. As the inspector says, she feels responsible, and if she leaves now and doesn't hear any more, then she'll feel she's entirely to blame. She'll be alone with her responsibility the rest of tonight, all tomorrow, all the next night. Here, the inspector is recognising that Sheila has shown remorse for her actions. Unlike the older Birlings, he sees that she will be eaten up by the guilt he has brought upon her, and is again compassionate towards her. Because of this compassionate side, Sheila is clearly fascinated with Inspector Gould. Look at the stage directions here. There's a sense of wide-eyed wonder in this line, as Sheila attempts to understand this harsh but kind policeman who is tearing her family apart. She recognises that the inspector is leading them to their own doom, saying, "He's giving us the rope, so we'll hang ourselves." But because she's fascinated by him, she carries on trying to break down the barriers that her parents and Gerald are building in front of the inspector, so much so that her parents begin to treat her like she's changed sides. Here, Sheila isn't trying to betray her family. She just wants to get everything out in the open, and knows it is inevitable, whereas her parents just want to try and stall the inspector until he runs out of questions and leaves. So the Birling parents are going to keep on lying and hiding information, but Sheila is on a quest for truth. As a result, when the inspector finally does leave, and her parents and later Gerald begin to dismiss the inspector's visit, Sheila is horrified and almost takes on the role of the inspector against her family for the rest of the play. She tells Gerald, "You and I aren't the same people who sat down to dinner here," and she clearly recognises the gravity and importance of the inspector's visit. And when the inspector is unmasked as not being a police officer, Sheila's sarcasm returns, and she remarks, "I suppose we're all nice people now," recognising that even if the events weren't real, the behaviour of the Birlings most definitely was. Even after Gerald has phoned the mortuary and discovered there is no suicide victim, and Arthur Birling has returned to making jokes and toasting his own good health, Sheila is still desperate to hold on to the lessons the inspector has taught them. "You're forgetting one thing I still can't forget. Everything we said had happened really had happened. If it didn't end tragically, then that's lucky for us. But it might have done." She tells her family, "You're pretending everything's just as it was before," and sarcastically suggests, "So nothing really happened, so there's nothing to be sorry for, nothing to learn. We can all go on behaving just as we did." So clearly at this point, she's genuinely disgusted by the behaviour of her family in their attempts to try and shrug off the responsibility of the situation. And she says to her father, "You began to learn something, and now you've stopped. You're ready to go on in the same old way." And you can see that she's really sad about this because she feels she's become a better person for the inspector's visit, and is disappointed in the rest of the family for not learning the same lessons she has. She by far shows the most mature reaction to the inspector's calling, which is ironic because Mr. and Mrs. Birling revert straight back to treating Sheila as a child, telling her she's hysterical and overtired. We'll finish this video with an interesting question. If the Birlings are right, and there is no inspector, no dead girl, and no tragedy for which to answer, then where does that leave each of them? Well, Mr. and Mrs. Birling have done nothing to worry about. Eric has stolen a bit of money which his family can easily afford to repay, and gotten a girl pregnant somewhere. But that's still a fixable situation. But what about Sheila and Gerald? Well, Sheila is never going to trust her fiancé again, and we don't know where they're going to go from here, so you could certainly argue that she is the only member of the family who still stands to be hurt by the inspector's visit. If you look at it this way, it's little wonder she's the one person in the room who doesn't want to see everyone forget the lessons they have learnt throughout the evening. Well, that's all on Sheila for now. Thanks for watching. Our next video will focus on Gerald Croft, but we'd recommend attempting to write a few sentences in answer to each of these questions before you move on. Question 1. What took place between Sheila and Eva Smith? Try to answer clearly and in chronological order. Question 2. How does Sheila's behaviour change throughout the play? Question 3. What do you think will happen between Gerald and Sheila after the play is finished? How would her family react to them either staying together or breaking up?